Welcome back to another episode of our second van build. I am super excited about this episode because we're going to talk about something that I'm good at for once. Most of the time when we do these DIY videos, we're talking about all the things that Andy's great at, but my specialties are planning and project management. So we get to talk a little bit about that today. We talked in our last episode about budget, but we didn't talk about our time budget. And we are on a pretty strict deadline with this project. So we have to get everything done in about 6 weeks, which for a van build is a very tight timeline. So we have to be very organized and very motivated. Obviously, before you start a van project, you have to start with something. And for us, that's a wants and needs list. For this project, we each individually created a wants and needs list based on our previous experience with our last van, things that we know about tiny living from living on our boats. And then we came together and we took both lists and basically compromised to figure out what was most important to both of us and made a bigger wants and needs list. For me, my needs were a queen-size bed, hot water, because I'm never living without hot water again, a large refrigerator. I wanted something front open as well, a toilet, and heat. Those are my non-negotiables. For Andy, he was really looking for a roof vent fan. He wanted an enclosed toilet space, enough for 2 computer workstations. And lastly, he wanted 76 inches of bed length. In our last van, he couldn't quite stretch out the full way, so that was important. We also had a lot of wants in common, which included an AC unit, a large water capacity, an electric kitchen, a shower of some kind, and some space for camera gear and potentially our folding bikes. This list was enough for me to get started with playing around with some layouts. Last time around, Andy took our ideas and immediately put them into CAD, which is a lot of work. And also, I was like over his shoulder the whole time, driving him a little crazy, like just wanting little tweaks here and there, especially when we were like initially playing with like larger design ideas. So this time around, I decided to use VanSpace 3D in order to take my ideas and get them into the computer before Andy went and made more detailed drawings in Fusion 360. VanSpace 3D really allowed me to take our wants and needs lists and figure out what was actually feasible. And we quickly figured out that an enclosed shower, which was on the wants list, not on the needs list, plus enough space for 2 workstations wasn't going to work. So we needed to come up with a compromise. And since we are so used to showering outside anyway on our boat, we do it about 95% of the time on Acadia, we decided to go with an outdoor shower setup here in the van. And we decided to do an enclosed toilet space instead of an enclosed shower toilet combo. Overall, I'm super happy with the process with the software, and it really allowed me to play with things 100 different ways before I brought them to Andy and come up with multiple designs to show him. And then we talked about the designs, and then he was able to take those and make super detailed drawings. As someone who's pretty tech savvy but has never really gotten around to learning Fusion 360, this was a great alternative for me for this purpose. But we do like to keep it real around here, and I will say that it isn't the most user-friendly software on the planet, but if you are pretty tech savvy or if you have the time to watch the tutorials, it is totally doable. And I really did find it useful. I also just wanted to provide a couple of tips that I learned along the way in case you're thinking about using VanSpace 3D for your design. If you're using the provided elements for things like toilets, solar panels, sinks, etc., make sure to double check the dimensions to the real dimensions provided by the manufacturer. You might need to get creative with placeholders if what you're planning is not in their library. I wouldn't get too caught up in colors or textures. It can get very frustrating to try to use their system for this. I also found it was much easier to create 2 designs, one for the interior and one for the exterior. When you're adding exterior elements, it can make it difficult to see the interior of the van. There are some ways to turn layers on and off, but I just found it way easier to just deal with 2 separate designs. And lastly, you will quickly get frustrated if you're using a trackpad. A mouse is definitely a must for this one. After all of that, I would still absolutely recommend VanSpace 3D if you're planning a van design and you're looking for a slightly easier option than the more traditional CAD options. Once I had a layout we were pretty happy with, we decided to take it into the van, tape it out, and see what it felt like in real life. Sometimes getting those tape lines on the floor allows you to see how a space is going to flow, and it really helped us kind of better visualize specifically our office space, and we ended up making some changes because of it. After we made those couple of adjustments inside VanSpace 3D, Andy took that model and turned it into a CAD model in Fusion 360. So we could get a lot more detailed, and we're able to take that model to create our materials lists. It's much easier with Fusion 360 to pull apart like the cabinets and stuff and figure out how many sheets of plywood you need and things like that. The last thing we did from a planning perspective was create a project plan. As you may have seen in past videos, which I'll link up here, we're big fans of Kanban boards. And typically that's what we use for massive projects like this. We use a physical board with sticky notes. It's much easier to keep track of everything, to move the sticky notes around and know where everything is. But this time we were trying to go fully digital. So basically what I did this time around was create a massive to-do list inside the Notes app on our iPhone, and was able to break that list into days. So like at the beginning of the week, I would make a goal list in terms of what got done each day, pulling from the master list that I made at the very beginning. It was huge. And as always, I highly, highly recommend breaking things into their smallest chunks. Something like the roof vent fan had like 5 tasks: cutting the hole, painting the hole, creating the frame, installing the fan, wiring the fan are all separate tasks, because it's really good for morale to be able to check that box and say that it's done. So the more check boxes you have, sometimes that's easier. You don't want to get too detailed because it can get a little overwhelming, but there's a nice balance here where it's like nice to get that nice hit of dopamine every time you hit the check box. And now that we finished talking about the planning portion, let's move on to prep. Today is the first day that we're actually getting to work on the van itself. It's not the most fun stuff. We've got a couple things we got to do to prep the van before we can get to the fun stuff. Today is that day. So we finally have a gorgeous day here in Maine that is warm enough for us to get some of this stuff done. So that's the plan this afternoon. So what are we doing?
We're going to fix a few spots in the floor. This has been a work van, so it has some riv nuts all over the place, and a few of them have ripped out and left like this like volcano of metal. So rather than like trying to hammer it flat and do all sorts of damage, we're just going to cut that little damaged section out and put a plastic plug on top of that. And the second thing is we need to address some of the like surface rust and things going on the floor, because it was a work van. Stuff was being dragged in and out all the time.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start by cutting the holes, because we're going to need to paint the parts that we also are cutting. So we're going to start there, and then we'll move on to painting.
We used a metal hole cutting bit, and a dull one at that, to cut out the raised portions of the floor where the previous hardware had been ripped out. We then took a wire wheel to all the nasty areas and removed all of the surface rust to bare metal. The last step before painting was to give the inside a thorough cleaning.
So we're just using this paint for no special reason other than it was available at the hardware store, because we're in the middle of nowhere, man. So you use what you can get.
We had originally planned to only paint the areas where we had removed paint, since no one would see it and we were only going to be doing it to prevent future rusting, but we ended up deciding to coat the entire floor with a fresh coat. Before we reveal the final results, let's do a quick budget breakdown. In this step, we spent $27 on a 1-year subscription to VanSpace 3D. We also spent $49.44 on paint and paint supplies for this part. That brings our total for this video to $76.44. And our total for this build so far to $13,349.44. Now to reveal the freshly painted interior. It looks so much better, and now we're ready to get started on the fun of actually building out our new home on wheels. We'll see you next time as we start cutting holes in the van.